Hi, I want to talk to you today about ethics, the most practical part of philosophy. Ethics asks three basic questions. What kind of person should I be? What should I do? And how should I decide? Let's look at those questions in turn. The first one, what kind of person should I be? That's a question of character. That's a question that Confucius would describe as a question of identifying virtues and vices. He describes it under the heading Ren, which broadly speaking means virtue. More specifically, he thinks benevolence, which he takes to be a sort of covering term for the most crucial, the most central virtues. That's an important question. What kind of person should I be? Sometimes I'm looking at very specific decisions, but often I'm thinking about very large-scale questions. I'm thinking, is this a trait of character that I want in myself? Or is it one that I should try to overcome? Is this a way in which I should reform? Or is this something about myself that I should develop more? Who is my ideal person anyway? What sort of person would I like to be? Who around me is a model for what I might become? All of those are questions related to character, and they're part of that first question of ethics. What kind of person should I be? The second question, what should I do? That's focused much more on specific decisions, on action. I'm facing a problem, I have to decide what to do. And often in ethics, people focus on that kind of question. They think, here's a situation, here's a problem I face. I've got to make a decision. Here are my options. What should I do? So ethics tries to formulate ways of thinking about that, ways of thinking about what I ought to do, what I ought not to do, what I must avoid. And so often ethicists appeal to rules, saying, well, here are the things that are your responsibilities that you are obliged to do. Here are things you must avoid. Those things are ethically forbidden. They are wrong. And that is all reasonable when we think about what we ought to do. The third question, how should I decide? That's something that relates to both of those other questions, what kind of person I should be as well as what I should do. And there I can think about how I do go about making decisions. What kind of method do I use? How do I go about thinking about a problem? Whether it's a large-scale question, like a question of what character traits I should try to develop in myself, but also small-scale questions. What should I have for lunch? What kind of career should I pursue? What should I do about this particular sort of problem that I face? And philosophers often think about real or hypothetical problem situations as a way of testing various methods for trying to decide what to do. Well, those three questions are basic questions of ethics. And you might think, as I think Confucius thinks, they're all independent questions. There are questions of virtue, of character, there are questions of action, and then there are questions of methods of making decisions. All of those are important, and you might think they're just three separate questions. Now, of course, they have some relation to each other. Presumably, it would be very odd to say, well, here's the kind of person you ought to be, somebody who just never does what he ought to do. But nevertheless, you might think, still, they have different components. They overlap maybe in certain ways, but they're different questions, even though they're closely related questions. There are other traditions in ethics, though, that take one of those questions as fundamental. You might, for example, think that questions of character are fundamental. Aristotle, for example, says actions are called just and temperate when they're such as the just or the temperate man would do. So we could think about actions being virtuous when they're the sort of thing that a virtuous person would do. And we could think, therefore, that the question of what I should do really reduces to the question of what kind of person I should be. I should act as someone who is what they ought to be would act in that situation. How should I go about deciding? The way a virtuous person would go about deciding. And so we might have that idea. Think character is really fundamental. The other things follow from that. People who subscribe to that view of ethics are known as virtue ethicists. They think questions of character, that question, what kind of person should I be, is really the most basic ethical question. You might think, as many philosophers throughout history have thought, and many religious traditions have thought, that the most basic question is really the question of action. What should I do? If you think that's fundamental, then you could say, well, what is virtue? A person is virtuous when they do what they ought to do. Now, Aristotle is concerned to say that's not true. They have to do them as a virtuous person would do them. It's not just a question of doing the right thing. You've got to do the right thing in the right way and for the right reason. So that's a contentious issue. But you might think, look, the virtuous person is one who does what they ought to do. The person who is vicious, who has a bad character, is the sort of person who does what they shouldn't do. Finally, you could think that that third question, how do I decide, is really the most fundamental. You might say, here's what it is to be virtuous, to reach your decisions in the right way. And here's what it is to do the right thing. It's to follow whatever is the output of that right method of decision. A good decision method, after all, is reliable. And so if you do that, you're reliably doing the right thing, and that makes you a virtuous person. Broadly speaking, you might adopt any of those views. You might also think that actually all of those stem from something else. Like all of them result from, for example, what God would want you to do. What kind of person would God want you to be? What would God want you to do? How would God want you to go about deciding? That's one possible way of seeing all three as reducing to something else. You could also give a naturalistic account like that. Really, it's just a question of what is evolutionarily most successful. What's the best way, and understood in evolutionary terms, of developing your character, or of acting, or of reaching decisions. There are many other possibilities in that general space. But I want to come back to what I mentioned earlier. You might also, thinking about this more, doubt whether all of those really come to the same thing. True, a good method for reaching decisions is going to reliably lead you to the right answer. But what if it doesn't always? Maybe the question of what the right thing to do is independent of the method you use. Some methods, good methods, lead you reliably to the right answer. But sometimes, maybe even the best methods lead you astray. And the same thing might be true of virtue itself. It might be that the person who, in general, is the best kind of person to be, nevertheless sometimes does the wrong thing. And so we could think, although there is certainly overlap and a relation among these, they're really independent questions. So, to come back to our central question, what is ethics all about? It's about what kind of person to be, what to do, and how to decide. Those are the three fundamental points. And any ethical theory is going to have to supply systematic answers to all three of those questions.